Welcome to The Grove, where we feature Evergreen members and their real-life stories of salvation, transformation, struggle, and hope. I'm Joy Gabbert, and today we have the privilege of hearing the testimony of Ron Thornton. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So why don't we start off? Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, who you're married to, and where you each serve at Evergreen?
My name is Ron Thornton. I'm married to Margie Thornton. We've been newlyweds for only 54 years. We currently serve with the senior adults. I teach the Sunday school class of my peers, which means they're 80 plus years old. Mm-hmm. It's been a wonderful experience. And then Margie and I work together discipling men and women to help them grow in their faith.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't you start off in your story with telling me what your life verse is?
My life verse is Galatians 2:20. It was the first verse I ever memorized. I memorized it in 1971. Paul writes and says, I've been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. And it has been a growing process learning how to apply that to my life.
Well, let's start then with when you were born. Now, you are a twin.
I am. I have a fraternal twin brother. I was born in 1944 in the small farming community of Floydada, Texas, and it had a community hospital of about 6 beds.
Wow.
My mother was a small woman, and when she was told that she was pregnant with twins, she was terrified. She thought she would not live through the experience, and so she called her sister in and wanted her to take care of my older brother and sister in case she died in childbirth.
Wow.
God was in control. He had my fraternal brother and I born 6 weeks premature, so that it would be small and easier for her to deliver. And this created a doctor for me, for the doctor, Dr. Pitts, it being a small community hospital. And so he got all his medical journals he could find and read up on what do you do with premature babies.
Yeah.
So he got a couple of cardboard boxes and made 2 incubators, one for me and one for Donald.
Wow.
And put us in it. And he hovered over us and became our ICU doctor and took care of us, and we thrived. When I was born, Mom and Dad now had 4 kids under the age of 4. So it was a very busy family.
Yeah. Did you grow up in a Christian home?
I did. Mom and Dad were both believers of Jesus Christ and took us to church. Dad was introduced to Christ by his mother when he was 13, just before he was orphaned. And then Mom met Christ in a revival. Her church in Floydada invited a preacher boy from Plainview to come preach a revival, and she said he preached hell so hot she could feel its fire, and she didn't want to go there and gave her life to Christ.
Yeah.
And then Mom and Dad met in church as young people.
Now, growing up, you were a little bit of the oddball in your family.
I was small for my age, and I had sandy red hair in a family of dark-haired people, and I stood out like a sore thumb. And I was teased continually about my red hair. I can tell you every joke there is about red hair. And I was teased by my brothers and by relatives, and I became a very angry, withdrawn child, and I hated the way God had created me. Wow. And I felt all alone. I had very few friends.
Yeah.
But Mom and Dad continued to love me and took me to church. And it was there that I heard the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ and his love for me and his forgiveness of my sins and how he accepted me because of his sacrifice.
So something happened then during church?
Yes, well, there was a miracle one Sunday. My brother and I were sitting in church across from Mom and Dad and with friends, and Donald got into a wrestling match with a friend and fell out in the aisle when the pastor was preaching. And stood up, and he looked over and he could see Mom and her angry stare, and he knew if he didn't do something, he was going to be in trouble when he got home.
Yeah.
So he walked to the front of the church.
Okay.
God had been dealing with me, but I didn't. couldn't get up enough courage to go up there, but I could follow him. So I followed him to the front of the church. And there at the front of the church, my pastor explained to me that I had to be honest with God and ask him to forgive me of my sins and to ask Christ to take control of my life.
Yeah.
So I asked God to forgive me and to come into my life, and he did. And for the first time in my life, I felt so loved and accepted, and I had a fresh new start in life. And I know my parents loved me, but I had never experienced any love like that before.
Yeah. So that's your moment of salvation.
Yes.
I love that, a mistake of your brother getting found out that he's messing around caused you to be able to, have the courage to go up front.
Yeah.
So then after that, you're new to Christ and you were angry.
Yes.
Now, did you just have this radical transformation and all of a sudden you were just wonderful and following the Lord, or?
Oh, I wish I could say that, but it wouldn't be true. The church I went to, Mom and Dad went to, structured the Sunday schools in such a way that I wound up in a grade behind. It meant that I was like going to the 7th grade with 6th graders and all.
Was that just because that you guys were smaller that they wanted you to be lower, or just the way that they structured?
It was because of our birthday, and it didn't fit within the church schedule.
Okay, so instead of being a 1st grader, they still had you with the kindergartners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you're in high school and going junior high, it's really frustrating. As a result of that, I tolerated church and began to drift. After high school, I attended Texas Tech.
So your dad said that you could live at home.
I could live at home and work and go to school, and that's the way we could pay for school. That's the only way we could do it.
Yeah.
I still was fighting feelings of not measuring up, and by my sophomore year, I had become so depressed that I became a hermit. I would go to school, go to work, go home to my bedroom and shut the door. I didn't date. I was miserable. I didn't know what to do. Didn't know how to get out of it. And I was shutting everybody out, including my parents. But God had a different plan for my life. As I said, I memorized Galatians 2:20. And so I was in my junior year in college, and my twin brother Donald was dating a girl at Tech by the name of Janet. And we had, Mother and Dad were having a birthday party and invited Donald and Jan, and she didn't want to go by herself, so she asked Donald to get a date for her roommate, and that was Margie. And so Margie and I began to date, and God was using her to draw me out of my shell. And one of the first things she told me was she wanted a Christian marriage, and I agreed. And neither one of us had any idea what that meant, but we'd been in church, and so we knew that's what we wanted. Mm-hmm. And she would provoke me to get me out of my shell, and she worked with me and was patient, and God used her to draw me out. And we married our senior year in college in 1967.
And then shortly after you all were married, this is during the Vietnam War.
Yes.
So you were drafted.
Yes. I was drafted once in January, and we were married in February, and I was drafted again in February, and I was going to Vietnam. God made a miracle, made a way for me to go in the Air Force into the officer candidate school. And so I went in, and my class in officer candidate school was the very last class where you could be a college graduate and get in. After that, you had to be a pilot or a navigator, and my eyes would not allow me to do that. Mm-hmm. So he really prepared a way for me. Mm-hmm. I was scheduled to go to Vietnam, but my actual assignment was in California because we were repairing the F-4 fighter aircraft that was shot up in Vietnam. They'd fly them back over to that base, and we'd repair them and get them airworthy and train the pilots and send them back.
Wow.
So I didn't have to go to Vietnam.
Okay.
I respect those that did, but I did not have to.
And while you all were there, you guys started having children.
Yes, we had a boy and a girl. I got to perform all kinds of duties there on the base instead of as an aircraft maintenance officer, squadron administrative officer, where I got to court-martial people, and the base mortuary officer, where I had to go and help plan the funerals and get the bodies ready and take care of all of that. And it was teaching me how to be compassionate and
Yeah,
caring.
that would have been really difficult.
In fact, the first funeral I had to plan was my assistant's. He died after I was appointed, and that was tough, but God was using me. We were active in a small Baptist church. I went the full bit. I was an ordained deacon, sang in the choir, taught Sunday school, went visiting, everything that I thought was the Christian life. Mm-hmm. And God began to test me to change my way of thinking.
So then you and your pastor had a little door-to-door ministry, and you met with a woman.
Yes, something that I have never experienced since then. A woman from the community called into the church and said, could someone please come out and tell her about Jesus Christ? Mm. And so we went out, and he would share and I would pray, and then I would share and he would pray. And after about 2 hours, her name was Mrs. Cherry, she was ready to surrender her life to Christ. Mm-hmm. Her husband sat and listened to her the whole time, and she bowed her head and she gave her life to Christ, and then he turned on her. And he said he wanted absolutely nothing to do with her Christian religion. And then the very next day, they were going to go on a 30-day vacation away from any church at all. And I felt like he was going to try to take 30 days and wash out everything she had done. Wow. I had nothing other than church to give her, and it just devastated me. I felt like I'd thrown her to the wolves. Yeah. I left that thinking, if all the activities I was doing is all there is to the Christian religion, I'm not sure I want to remain a part of it. Mm. I mean, I was ready to leave the church.
Yeah, because you didn't have tools for her to be able to defend her faith.
That's right. I'd never been discipled. I'd just been a church attender. I believed Christ. I knew him, but I'd never been discipled. My required time in service was up, so I resigned my commission and got out. And we left the Air Force and moved back to Texas, to Denton, Texas. And I started to work there at the Denton State School for the mentally challenged. And I was a resident landscape architect and head of the horticulture department, which meant I had to design a greenhouse to be built with the challenged students.
Oh, that's cool.
And teach them how to grow plants and plant them in the landscape.
Yeah.
We joined a church out of habit. In that church, there was a man that had been full-time with the Navigator organization, but he had left to move to that area to become a professor at a junior college so he could take care of his wife who had cancer. Mm-hmm. And when Jerry got up in the church and began to pray, he sounded like he was assaulting the gates of hell. And when he quoted scripture, he sounded like he had written the Bible. It was with such authority. And he befriended me and Margie and asked if we'd like to learn how to live our faith. Mm-hmm. We said yes, and so he placed us under a couple that had been discipling, and we began to grow in our faith. Still, growing in my faith like that, mm-hmm. Margie and I were having conflicts. Mm-hmm. I felt like the drive to excel in my work, and so I got completely involved in my work at the school, and I'd go home tired, and that's all I wanted to do is sit down and read the paper. And I told Margie when we bought our house that we weren't going to be there but a couple of years, so don't bother fixing it up. Mm. And she felt trapped. 2 small children. She felt like she couldn't even buy a gallon of paint to paint a bathroom. Yeah. And so the tension began pulling us apart. And this couple reached out to us and asked us if we would attend a conference with them on husband-wife relationships according to the Bible. We'd put down our deposit, and we drove from Denton, Texas to Lubbock, Texas, and dropped the kids off with my parents and started off and got as far as Amarillo, Texas, and just had a constant argument and got out and said, why are we going? Mm. And we finally said, well, we've made a non-refundable deposit. Fran and Larry are waiting on us, so we'd better go. Yeah. So we went, and God was working on me. Started on a Sunday, and by Thursday I was black and blue. And I had to get down on my knees in my room and confess to God that I've been blaming Margie for all my problems, and I'd seek his forgiveness. And then ask Margie to forgive me, and she did. And I'm so thankful because we'd been divorced if I hadn't, and we've been enjoying life now for 57 years.
So after that, you all moved again. Where did you move to?
We moved from Denton to Tyler, and this couple that was working with us in Tyler called ahead in Denton, had a man waiting on me to continue discipling. And God did that over about a 10-year period of time. When Ken would disciple us in Tyler, another man joined him. Bob from Dallas would drive 90 miles every Friday to work with us using a brand new material from the Navigators called the 2.7 series.
Okay.
And I began interested at that time in discipling men and women. And Bob told me if I'd move to Dallas and get a job, he would work with me and see if it would lead to full-time service with the Navigators. So Margie and I prayed about it and decided if God offered us a job, we'd go. I submitted applications. I got one interview with a startup housing development in Dallas, Texas, and I went and interviewed them. And the construction foreman said the only job I qualified was his, but he would offer me the sanitation department and the sprinkler system for the housing development. I thought about it, and I thought, I don't want to be a professional garbage collector. It was my pride. I said no. That little housing development is what's called Los Colinos, and it's one of the richest housing developments in Texas now. But I was so stubborn I couldn't see that. I left the job that I had and went into sales. I asked God to give me a promise out of it, and he gave me Deuteronomy 9:6. And he says, I'm going to give you this land, not because of your righteousness, but because my glory. I know you're a stubborn and stiff-necked person. And I thought, can I have another one? And he said, no, because I was not living up to Galatians 2:20. And so I took a job in sales and was fired. Couldn't find a job. My twin brother was working for Texas Instruments in Lubbock, and he made an off-the-cuff remark to his supervisor, and I was hired sight unseen to work as a supervisor at Home Computers.
Okay.
This was in the early 80s. And the company went from 600 to 6,000 to 600 employees in a year and a half.
Oh, wow.
I could sense some things were happening, and so I went to my boss and asked him, I said, should I buy a house now or wait about 6 months? And he says, well, I'm committed. I bought a house, so should you. So I bought a house, and before we'd even made our first payment, he called me in and he says, things ain't working out. You got 30 days.
Oh, my goodness.
And there was no jobs in Lubbock, and so we began to pray. We didn't know what to do. And God moved, and he came to me and said, the company made a mistake hiring so many at one time. If I would please accept a corporate move with the company, they would move me to another plant and buy my home and pay for all the expenses. And so we moved from Lubbock to Odessa. We moved to Odessa, and it was there that I began to work with people. God just blessed me tremendously as I did. And I got to see lives changed. One of my funniest experiences was with a retired dentist. And this man came in on our first meeting and put a name tag in front of his desk. Nobody else did that.
Yeah.
And he says, my name is Dr. Blair.
Uh-oh.
And that's what he wanted us to call him, was Dr. Blair, heavy on the doctor. And he was retired. And so as we got into how to grow in our faith, we got to the point of making our Bibles personal by reading and marking in our Bibles. And he says, no, my mother said you never mark in a book, and I just can't do it. So one of the members of the group went down to the local discount store and bought a Bible and brought it to the next meeting and laid it in front of him and says, Dr. Blair, I give you this Bible, and I give you permission to write in it. The next meeting we had, his name tag changed. He had written on it in big letters, Theron. He says, my name is Dr. Blair, but my friends can call me Theron.
Oh, wow. I love that.
And we got to discussing about how to share our faith. And he said, I don't know anyone. So one of the members of the group says, here is this teenager in our church that's very close. Pray for him. And he did. And one Sunday I watched as this teenager went to the front of the church to surrender his life to Christ. And I looked over at Dr. Blair, and tears were just streaming down his cheeks. His prayers had been answered.
Wow.
So he was learning how to live his faith. But I was still trying to manage my own life and trusting God with my work, not trusting God with my work. I applied and accepted a corporate purchasing manager position with a major medical equipment manufacturing company in Oklahoma City. Mm-hmm. 2 weeks after I was hired, they fired the plant manager and brought in somebody else to fire me. Mm. Took them about a year and a half, and I was fired because I would not compromise my ethics. I followed the company rules and regulations in purchasing, mm-hmm. and it created conflict with some of the department heads, so they fired me. Again, Margie and I had just purchased a house and hadn't made our first payment. She didn't work. We didn't know what we were going to do. I was at the top of my career field, and I applied for over 100 known openings throughout the United States and got zero response. Mm. So we prayed about it, and we felt like maybe we should start our own business. And I went to Dallas and bought a package from a man about working with used car dealers, mm-hmm. doing service work, getting cars ready to sell. God was still working on me because I had to start over 3 times the first year.
Yeah.
And it was so bad that there'd be mornings we'd get up and there wouldn't be any work. And we would have to literally pray, and my phone would go off and I'd go to work. Wow. Did that for 20 years, and God never failed to meet our needs. But He reduced me to utter dependence on Him, and that's exactly what I needed. Because as that took place, I got to see Him move, and I got to be used by Him. Mm-hmm. I got to disciple men on the car lots and got to see them come to Christ. I got to see them grow, and it was just amazing. And I would never have been able to do that had I stayed in management that I was pursuing.
Yeah. Tell me about a couple of the relationships that you had during that time.
I was working with a group of men on a car lot. I got to introduce one of the salesmen to Christ, and all the others wanted to join in on the study. And one of the men there was a real rough character, and he shared with me that he had been in the mob in Chicago and been sent by the mafia from Chicago to Las Vegas to start a new operation. And he got there and found out he came with a wife and didn't want her. Mm. And he said, they can be very persuasive, and he showed me the scars where they broke his nose and both wrists, wow. And he fled and became a used car salesman because they couldn't track him. He could go and move around mm-hmm. as he felt the need. And I worked with him, and I still have his Bible that he gave me in appreciation. Mm. And one of the other men was a salesman, but he had a hard time selling because he was nearly deaf. And I had another dear friend who had a nonprofit trust in Dallas encouraging people, and I told him about this man, and he said, "We'll find out what the best hearing aids cost." And this was in the 90s. They were $6,000. So he wrote him out a check for $6,000. Mm. I got it and took it to John, and he looked at it and says, "I can't take this." I said, "It's a gift." He says, "I could never pay it back." I said, "It's a gift. You need hearing aids." "Well, what if they don't cost this much?" I said, "It's a gift." So he got hearing aids, and he came to me and says, "I have money left over. What do I do?" And I said, "I don't know. It's your money." He said, "You mean I can make up my house payments so I won't get evicted?" And I said, "Yes." And he'd be sitting at his desk, and people would come in and look at his cars. And he'd grab his ears and pull them out, and he'd say, "Look what God's done." He was so excited about living for Christ. And the experiences just go on and on. People all the way from that to people coming out of mental health institutions for trying to commit suicide, to, mm-hmm. Just and common people, just wonderful.
Yeah. Now, tell me, it was around this time, too, that God started wanting you to go to truck stops.
Yes, I had a dear friend that became a pastor at a truck stop on the west side of Oklahoma City. Mm-hmm. And I was working about 50 hours a week and discipling men, and he came to me and he says, "I want you to go to this truck stop on the east side." And I said, "Well, I'll think about it." He said, "I didn't ask, go."
All right. Yes, sir.
And I had learned that that was probably God speaking, so I said yes. And so I got to spend 12 years at the truck stop as a chaplain.
Wow.
And we got to see about a trucker a week come to Christ out there, and it was amazing to see lives changed. Not with just the truckers. I had a friend at the church that was playing the same part that I was playing in California, deacon and everything else. He was leaving church one Sunday, and he says, I wish somebody had deaconed me. So I worked with him for 2 years and got to see him grow, and he even joined me at the truck stop to preach. And he told me later on, he says, don't forget you ever rescued me. And another young man that I knew that I started discipling as junior in high school, he went through college and seminary and all, came to Oklahoma City and took a secular job and came to work with me at the truck stop while he was trying to find a church to go with. He matured so well and became such a practical pastor. He's now a pastor in Wichita, Kansas at a church he founded. It's so good to be able to work with people and see get God to use them.
Yeah. Now, so truckers, they'll have their routes, and so you might see them come back through your stop. But they're not there for very long. So how would you disciple a trucker or tell them about the Lord?
I have been given foundational verses to use. And one Sunday after the service was over, I sat down beside a trucker and I looked at him and I said, have you ever absolutely given up and surrendered your life to Christ? And he says, no. And I said, would you like to? And he said, yes. And so we prayed and he surrendered his life to Christ. And then he looked at me square in the eyes and says, I don't feel any different now. What? I had been prepared because God had sent men in my life to prepare me. So I took his Bible and I turned to 2 Corinthians 5:17, where it says, therefore, if any man's in Christ, he's a new creature. The old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come. I underlined it, put his name and date at the top because I was giving him a Bible, and then went to the front of the Bible and put the page number. And then I went through the assurances of salvation, answered prayer, forgiveness, victory, and guidance, and went and underlined those passages and went to the front of the Bible and put the pages on it. And I wasn't looking at him. I was busy with my Bible, with his Bible, doing that. And when I finished, I looked up and he grinned from ear to ear and says, it does work.
Yeah.
Because he had something to take with him to look back on it and understand and remember what had happened.
Wow, I love that.
And that's what we tried to do.
Yeah. And so you were doing that for some years, but then you were getting to the point where you were deciding if you were going to retire.
Yes. We wanted to retire, and we were praying about it. God works in mysterious ways, honestly. A friend of mine from Wichita Falls, Texas, wrote me a letter encouraging Margie and I to pray for 45 days straight. And during that time, I was working in my truck, a one-man operation, and I fell and severely injured my right shoulder. And I went to the doctors, and they said 6 months rehab, and then surgery, and then 6 months rehab. Well, that closed my business, so we sold it. The man that I had said that, don't forget that I ever rescued him, called me and says, I want your truck and your fifth wheel. I'll pay you what you gave for it 3 years earlier. I got to have it. So he paid me cash for that, and that financed the move. We arrived in Broken Arrow, and we bought a home, and there was a Baptist church close to us, and so we joined. It was not where God wanted us to be, but I was freed up, and the neighbors were friendly, and I invited them into my home for a Bible study. And one of the men, as a result, got his Bible and went back to church after 25 years absence. Another one was a ex-Vietnam veteran who had severe PTSD, was violent. He was at my house one day, and we were sitting at the dining room table, and I looked at him, and I said again to him, I said, have you ever reached a point in your life where you just gave up and surrendered your life to Christ? And he says, no. And I says, would you like to? He said, yes. And so we prayed, and just the peace that settled over him. He was dying, and just the peace that settled over him was so wonderful. And I was in their home, he and his wife's home, about a week later, and she said, when are you going to do the same for me that you did for Tom? So I got to introduce her to Christ. She called me a little while after that and said, Tom's fallen, please come help. And so I rushed over to their house, and I got to cradle his head in my lap as he died, and I got to testify at his funeral how I got to introduce him to life, and then get to see him step into life, and it was wonderful. Now, God led us from the church that we were in, the little small church, to Evergreen, and he was using me where I was to do what I did with the neighbors. And so when I moved here, God began a work of discipleship here with me.
Do you remember what brought you guys to Evergreen in the first place? Like, why did you choose Evergreen?
Oh, the pastor called me in to be an intermediary between he and the choir director.
At your other church?
At the other church. They were having conflict. So I agreed, and I sat down with them, and I used the verses in Matthew about reconciliation, and I explained to them that we forgive, and when we forgive, we do like Christ did our sins, place it under the blood of Christ, never to be brought up again, and we get on with life. The pastor couldn't do that, and it drove the choir director away, and the pastor looked at me and said, My, isn't it mysterious how God works? And I looked him square in the eyes, and I said, You did this, God didn't. And that's when I decided it was time to leave. I had already been listening to Pastor Michael's sermons online, and I had read his personal testimony, and I thought this is where we need to be. And so we moved here and moved our membership, and that's where God wanted us to be.
So then when you came here, did you just jump right into discipling people?
The way I believe in discipling people, I pray about it and ask God to bring people into my life, because I have learned over the years that each person he places in my life is a treasure, one that I can love and help to grow. And for me to go out and try to compel people to come in, I don't want it to be me doing it. I want it to be God doing it. And so I'm willing to wait. Now, I did it like things go to Men Venture, and I took part in men activities. And in fact, I've asked people if in places like that, would you like to be discipled? Yes, they would, because God was putting us together, and it just grew from there.
Is Evergreen when you started getting involved with missions, like to Russia?
I got involved. I went to Russia when we were in Oklahoma City. When we got there, I was told that I would be responsible for discipling, I think it was 12 members of the church, and we were only going to be there 10 days.
Wow.
So I had to meet with them every night. I had some discipling material in Russian with me, and we would go over it every night. And they got so excited. In fact, there was a lady there who was in her 50s, and 2 years earlier she had been, when she surrendered her life to Christ, she had been miraculously delivered from alcohol. Mm-hmm. But her husband was a drunk and kicked her out because he lost his drinking partner. And so she was just hungry. And we would go over one aspect of living the disciple life on one night, and she'd take it to the streets the next day. It was amazing. And the way God moved, they looked at the material that we brought, and we got about halfway through it, and they smiled and said, yes, we can continue it on. Thank you for what you've done.
Tell me about the relationship you had with a woman who had Asperger's.
God placed a woman in my life to disciple, and she suffered from Asperger's syndrome. And she was such a disruption that there was even some of the deacons in the church wanting to ask her to leave. And I said, no, she's part of the body. Mm-hmm. And so God placed her with me to disciple her, and I worked with her for 2 years, and I thought, I'm not making any effect at all. So I was reaching my wits' end, and I began to pray, God, how much longer do I need to do this? And she came to me, and she said, after 2 years, I've been thinking about what you taught me. And I discovered I never surrendered my life to Christ, and I just did. Thank you. And worth it all.
Okay, so then now you're at Evergreen.
Yes.
And you've discipled many men here.
Yes.
My husband included.
Yes.
Yeah, so give me the dirt on him. No, just kidding. No, so, and you pretty much follow the navigators. That's what you use when you disciple.
I do. I use what's called the Navigator 2.7 series. I have looked at many, many different discipling materials, and this is the clearest, easiest to follow, easiest to understand material that I have found. And it's true to the Scriptures, and I've seen the results that it brings about. So, yes, I use it.
Yeah. Okay, so as we are starting to come to an end, I just have a question. If there's somebody in our church, let's start with in our church, who is looking to be discipled, how would you encourage them to be able to find somebody to disciple them?
Ask, because God has put me here for the specific purpose of discipling people. And since I'm retired, I can be flexible with my time. Right now, I'm working with a man that works for Kimberly-Clark Paper Company, and he flips his work schedule. He works nights and then days, then nights, and so I have to be flexible and work with him to be able to meet with him. I can do that.
Now, how about somebody who maybe would never have a chance to come to Evergreen? They're somewhere else, but they also feel the pull to be discipled. How could they find somebody?
Well, depending on where they are, there are navigator representatives throughout the United States that could come in contact with them. Mm-hmm. We can be creative. I know Justin McKenzie is discipling people in Brazil through the Zoom meetings. Mm-hmm. So, with modern technology, there's ways it can be done even if they are in distant places.
How can they find somebody with the navigators?
They can go to the navigator.org website and look for the navigator representatives in their state and see.
You wanted to share the commissioning verse for discipleship.
Matthew 28:18 through 20. And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. That's our direction. But I like to say that's a double-edged sword, because when we teach them to observe all that that Christ has commanded them, yes, we're taking them through the Scriptures and teaching them how to live. And at the same time, they're observing us to see if it's real. And it is the way to live.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to today's episode. If you have any questions or want to hear about our church, please visit our website at evergreenbc.org.